Mr. Salomone, are you ready to go?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, let's start. Question number 1, Dan. The floor is yours.
All right. As you know, Daniel Jeremiah gave us a nice gift just as we were banging our heads against the wall trying to think of content. He dropped a nice little prospect rankings 2.0 yesterday. Had some guys rise and fall. Most of the top guys, I think there's kind of a consensus, as is typically the case with the top 10 to 15 guys. But I guess my question to you guys is, I know a lot of people pulled from Dave Gettleman's season-ending press conference about the offensive playmakers. But in the same breath, he also talked about just getting Daniel Jones over that hump and finding the right guys for him. And based on how you guys are seeing the board shake out, do you think that would be an offensive playmaker, like a skill guy, or are you seeing offensive linemen start to come into play?
It's a really good question, Dan, and I agree with you, and I think your point that you help the quarterback by giving him weapons and by helping him up front. I think you do both things. So I think you're right on the money with that. And to me, Lance, I think there's a pretty good chance that Rashawn Slater, who I think is the consensus number 2 offensive lineman on the board. Now, there's a chance Dallas takes him at 10, and this whole conversation is moot, right? But I think there's a chance he's sitting there at 11. And if he's there and those top 4 playmakers we've talked about, and folks out there, you know the names, Kyle Pitts, Devonta Smith, Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, if those guys are gone, for me, if the Giants have Rashawn Slater as the next best player on their board, or maybe Christian Darrisaw, whoever, one of these offensive linemen ranked higher than the defensive players that could be available, I, for one, and Paul's not here to scream at me about it because I heard his soliloquy at the end of yesterday's show for the fans that didn't. I would have no problem picking an offensive lineman there, especially someone like Slater that can play both guard and tackle.
Yeah, I'm completely with you, John, and I echoed those sentiments at the tail end of yesterday's show in between Paul Dottino's soliloquy.
By the way, I was very impressed with your resistance to not try to argue with him more there, knowing we were at the end of the show. That was a very nice job at it.
Well, I do what I can to help move things along. At times. Not always, but sometimes I will prioritize.
Only sometimes, that's true.
Yes. But I'm with you, John. I think there's room for the Giants to add depth and competition on the offensive line. I think you brought up a good point. If I am to draft an offensive lineman and I'm the Giants, I do think somebody that plays guard and tackle would hold a bit more value, only because of the fact that you just drafted Andrew Thomas. Okay, Matt Peart was a relatively high pick. And Nate Solder, once again, still remains a question mark. So the Giants need to say to themselves, okay, who do we envision being the 2 starting tackles? Do we think we're going to rotate like we are last season? Which means that if there's not necessarily room for the guy to come in and carve out a significant role on the edge, then at least you hope that maybe he can compete on the interior. So I like the idea of if you're going to go offensive line at 11, then go with somebody that has some experience on both sides, at guard and tackle, however you want to break it down. But, as Dan pointed out and Dave Gettleman emphasized, the Giants, there's a reason why they scored less than 20 points a game last season. They need help. They need help in getting into the end zone. And as much as the offensive line helps do that, you also need guys that can operate in open space and make those big game-changing plays. So I think there's arguments on both sides, but I would say if you were to ask me defensive player, offensive lineman, skill position player, I would put offensive lineman, skill position player on offense first, second, and third before I'd really heavily consider a defensive player.
Yeah, and I just think it's important to point out that while there's hopes that guys like Shane Lemieux and Matt Peart can become those starters at those spots, and it's reasonable to think that those players can improve in their second year, there's also evidence, Lance, and plenty of evidence, just go through the draft every year, of 3rd and 5th round picks on the offensive line never becoming good enough to become starters. So we just don't know what those guys are going to be, good or bad. So if you can add someone that you have reasonable confidence is going to be a really good player, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Well, real quickly, before we move on with Dan, I think the perfect example of what you just laid out, John, is, I don't know if you were aware, Isaiah Wilson of the Tennessee Titans, who was their first-round pick in 2020, there's already talk that he may want to step away from football. So here's an example of the Tennessee Titans used a first-round pick on an offensive lineman last year, and now all of a sudden, after 1 year of football, he may want to hang it up, and you now have a wasted resource that you thought was going to be a building block on your offensive line. So that to me is yet another example. I know I pinpointed offensive lineman. It can happen, granted, for any position, but it's an example of why I continue to emphasize there are no guarantees in the NFL draft, whether you're picking 5, whether you're picking 15th, or you're picking 23rd, because you just don't know what's going to happen with injuries, and you also don't know what's going to happen in terms of the frame of mind of a prospect.
Yeah. And look, the offensive line to me is a premium position now, Lance. It's a lot easier to find a wide receiver than to find a good offensive lineman. So if you can find one in the draft, and the work there is never done. There's 5 starters there. Guys retire, they move on. To your point, they become free agents. You always have to continue to work in order to make that group better. Remember, Kevin Zeiler, he's under contract, right? But his contract's going to be up soon, even if he's on the roster this year, right? So you're going to have to prepare for life after Zeitler at some point too. All right, Dan, question number 2 for you.
Number 2, speaking of getting into the end zone more, Lance, you were talking about that, the struggles there. Nobody did that for more positions than Devonta Smith. As the draft process started, right after he won the Heisman, national championship, kind of became kind of a pipe dream, I think, for Giants fans to have him available for the Giants at 11. But the way things are shaking out, do you guys see that he could be a possibility for the Giants?
Yes, I believe the least likely players, in my opinion, that'll be there at 11 are Kyle Pitts and Jamar Chase, because I think they're very unique, and I think they're kind of special in what they do and how they do it. I'm not sure, Lance, would you say there's an equal chance Smith or Waddle would be there at 11, or do you think there's a much better chance Waddle would be there? And the reason I phrase it this way is that everyone, to Dan's point, Heisman Trophy winner, 20 touchdowns, all this stuff, had Devonta Smith, maybe even as their number 1 guy. You know, everyone scouts national championship games and people lose their minds, and that's what they do. But you look at Bucky Brooks' recent big board, and you look at Daniel Jeremiah's, they both have Jalen Waddle rated ahead of Devonta Smith. So I think there's a real chance Smith is there. Do you think there's a chance Smith is there? And how do you measure Waddle versus Smith? Which guy is more likely to be there at 11th, Lance?
Well, I've seen a lot of projections where, to your point, Waddle has been selected to go ahead of Devonta Smith. And I'm a little bit hesitant of Waddle, not to say that he's not a good player, but, I mean, he barely played this past season. And once again, he didn't look 100% healthy in that championship game. Now, granted, I understand when you're going to put him out on the football field in September, he's going to be far removed from that injury. But, you know, there is a reason why he missed time, and durability, I think, is important to evaluate, and you're not going to have maybe as close access to these players. So if Devonta Smith is there for the Giants at 11, I would think that would be a huge victory for the Giants. To say that you could add a Heisman Trophy winner who I understand there's questions about his body build, but I continually emphasize, John, he didn't miss one game. He played double-digit games over the last 3 seasons. Yep. So, you know, that to me proves, hey, he could hold up regardless of the hits he's taking. So if they land either one of them, I think that's a significant victory. It answers the question mark of adding a playmaker on offense. But if you were to ask me who's more likely, I would say probably Devonta Smith is more likely to be there for the Giants than Waddle.
Wow.
Because
okay.
I don't think Waddle has as many question marks about body size than Devonta Smith does. And I think that's maybe why a guy like Devonta Smith could fall. However, one thing I did want to add, and Dan alluded to this, you look at Daniel Jeremiah's top 50, he only has 2 quarterbacks in his top 10 prospects. Now, Jeremiah is not going based on need of who's selecting at that pick. He's just ranking the players. So remember, the curveball here is how many teams get antsy and itchy to draft a quarterback. He's got Trey Lance at 11, and then he has Justin Fields at 12. Now, that's the ranking based on just the overall position of the player. So if there is somebody that moves up, it benefits the Giants. But maybe there's a draft where teams are not enamored with the quarterback class. If only 2 guys get selected in the top 10 based on Daniel Jeremiah's rankings, you know, that's when it gets very tricky of whether or not Devonta Smith could fall to 11.
Well, and I think that brings us to Dan's next question, right, Dan?
It is, yeah. A lot of that depends on, obviously, is how many quarterbacks go. And if you're a Giants fan, you're hoping as many as possible go. And so somebody like a Devonta Smith could fall to you at 11. How many are realistically you think going to go before the Giants?
I don't think you'll have more than 4. And I realize I'm, not exactly, drawing a bright line in the sand here and having a hot take there. But if you made me guess right now, Lance, how many quarterbacks I think go in the top 10, And this opinion could change once we get through free agency and we see how this quarterback carousel plays out and what teams wind up with quarterbacks, what teams don't. Based on the movement we've been seeing, and I think we're going to see, I believe all 4 quarterbacks that we mentioned at the top of this draft, Zach Wilson, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, Trey Lance, all 4 of those guys will be gone in the top 10. And my guess is that you'll see at least 1 trade, maybe 2, either from teams already ahead of the Giants or teams jumping ahead of the Giants to select those quarterbacks. So if you made me take an over-under right now and make me try to put my finger on a number, I would say 4.
I would lean more towards 3, and this is just my personal feeling. I find it hard to believe, and I know what you're going to say, John. It only takes 1 team, okay? So I have you echoing in my head as I make this statement. But I find it very hard to believe, and I know that we often throw out copycat league in the NFL, and maybe that's more for scheme than actual decision-making. But when you look at what happened with Dwayne Haskins, when you look at what happened with some of these other quarterbacks in recent history who did not play a high volume of games, John, as a starter, why would you take Trey Lance in the top 10 if he played only 17 games in his entire collegiate career? I would be very worried about investing such a valuable pick in a quarterback. It's not to say that Lance can't be a good player. It's just you look at the fact that we've had 4 quarterbacks in the 2015 and 2016 drafts combined who went 1 and 2 overall that are no longer with their original teams. And those guys played a little bit more than Trey Lance. When is the writing going to be on the wall to say it's just not worth it? Maybe preach a little bit more patience. So that's why I would lean towards the 3 versus the 4th one being Trey Lance.
I also agree that Trey Lance has a lot of risk. He's just so damn toolsy, and he has his ability, his athleticism, his arm. I would be very, very worried about taking him in the top 10. I'm with you, but I think there will be a team, whether it's, Washington or Carolina or one of these teams that don't have a long-term answer at quarterback right now, or maybe the Niners say, look, we can stick with Jimmy G for 1 year, but we want to try to groom this guy to replace him at some point. Maybe they like him and they move up. Or the Bears. We all know how desperate the Bears are for a quarterback, but again, I'm not sure Lance is the guy for them because they want someone that can win now, right? And I think Lance is kind of more of a developmental guy because, as you mentioned, his lack of experience. But I think at some point somebody does trade up and go there. And I'll throw this out there too. I mean, just look at the history of these Ohio State quarterbacks, Dan. I'm just not sure you can trust Justin Fields to be a great pro, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thanks for that shot there.
All right, let's move on to your next
question. Haskins and Fields, he must be loving this conversation.
I had to do it.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes. But, yes, all right, so we've been on the air for 15 minutes, and what haven't we talked about? Defense. Is there anybody at number 11 you're running up there that's still on the board? No question. You punted his name.
No question, no matter what I punch his name, no. I'm not there with any of these guys yet. I have significant concerns about any of the pass rushers there. And pass rushers, if you look historically, have a very high bust rate. So I'd be very careful about reaching for a pass rusher at number 11 if you're not very sure about them. I have not watched him yet. We're doing, I believe, edge rushers and linebackers tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, that'll be me, Paul, and Jeff. So we'll talk about Micah Parsons. I'm going to watch him this afternoon. I think based on the scouting reports I've read, he's probably the guy, assuming you're clear on all the off-the-field stuff that's kind of out there with him, that you would feel best about. And then I think the 2 top corners, Lance, right? You're looking at Patrick Surtain, the second, I think, or the third? I think he's the second. And then you have Caleb Farley out of Virginia Tech. And some people like J.C. Horn, too, but I'm not sure he's going to be the pick at 11. Those would be the other guys I think you look at. But, look, corners can be dicey, too. They can be very boom or bust, especially this early in the draft. So I feel much better about my choices on offense at this pick than I do a defense, which is, I think, Lance, is something you echoed earlier, too, right?
Yeah, I did echo that. I think that there is potential where the Giants pick, especially based on the conversation that we're all having, and you believe 4 quarterbacks are going. If that comes to fruition, I'd say that very good news for the Giants. in all likelihood, of somebody getting to the Giants at 11 who can make a significant difference in year one on offense. And that's what I think you need to ask yourself if you're the Giants. If we take an offensive player, do we believe this guy comes in immediately year one and helps out Daniel Jones? If the answer is yes, then to me there's no hesitation that, to go back to Dan's question, how would I then leap over if the answer is yes, an offensive guy could come in at 11, impact this overall unit immediately, to then argue a defensive player could have as much of an impact on the opposite side of the ball in year one. The other thing is, I think you got to talk to Patrick Graham and you have to ask him, hey, based on how much you mix and match with personnel, if we gave you this cornerback, one of the two you just mentioned, John, does that take your defense to another level, or do you feel with the safety/corners you have on the roster, can you make do if we maybe don't address defense until the second round? And then it also depends on, of course, what they do in free agency. Leonard Williams and Dalvin Tomlinson. If Leonard Williams leaves, if they don't get him back, if they don't give him the franchise tag, does the itch to get somebody that has upside in getting after the quarterback, does that change the outlook? See, that's why you really need to know what happens in free agency. But as it stands right now, it's hard for me to argue that somebody who would be there at 11 on defense would bring as much of an impact as somebody that could grab on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, and let me throw out Micah Parsons as well. We saw the Giants use two of those off-ball linebackers at times last year, but frankly, Lance, in a lot of those passing situations, we saw Jabril Peppers go down there and play linebacker. So,
well, that's what I'm saying, the mixing and matching on defense.
Right, and I'm just trying to get in depth at that one specific position because I think you made a really good point. Are you then going to not have one of those extra safeties on the field? Are you going to take Blake Martinez off the field? If you want to have both, if you want to have Micah Parsons on the field on passing downs, he's such a good athlete, he can cover. I think you'd want him on the field then. Yeah, look, it's easy. Put him next to Blake Martinez and first and second down, third and short. That's easy. You put him in there. But in passing situations, then how are you going to adjust how you handle things? Do you want to take your leader like Blake Martinez off the field? Do you want to take a guy like Jabril Peppers off the field? Or then you have to take a Logan Ryan or a McKinney off the field? These are difficult questions then in terms of how they use their guys last year. We saw the value of having two very good linebackers in Levante David and Devin White in the Super Bowl. And we've seen that even, when Dallas a couple years ago had both Van Der Esch and Jalen Smith playing at a high level. They didn't play that way this year, but they did in years prior. How valuable that can be. But how does having two of those guys like Blake and potentially a Micah Parsons play into what Graham's trying to do defensively?
Well, plus, remember, Parsons is a linebacker, okay? And one of my favorite statistics. So, listen, no disrespect to Parsons. He's the type of guy that I think could cover sideline to sideline. There's a lot of athleticism, a lot of talent to work with. But, guys, and Dan knows this too because he's been, unfortunately, around me long enough, okay?
He has read a lot of your Factor Fiction and Cover 3 answers over the years.
So he knows where I'm going to go. 1984 is the last time the Giants took a linebacker in the first round. So, listen, could the lengthy streak end? Absolutely. We have this conversation all the time, but the track record for me bodes very well. So that's more of a reason why I don't think the Giants are taking Micah Parsons.
Dan?
That and depth, those are the two things that Lance I'd like to talk about.
There you go.
Veteran depth, by the way. Lance loves his veteran depth. Dan, good stuff. We'll have you on next week. Maybe we can dive into some mocks and maybe Bucky Brooks' top 5 at some of these spots, all right?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Thank you, Danny. Good stuff, my friend.
See you guys.
Dan Salomone. Excellent job. You see all his content all the time on Giants.com. It'll be a weekly guest for us here on Big Blue Kickoff Live.